Last time we were talking about the Opium Wars. We talked about the Second Opium War. And we talked about how in the Second Opium War, which is also called the Arrow War, it starts off when the Arrow, a ship flying the British flag but with a Chinese crew, was pirating and smuggling opium. They were arrested by the Chinese government, which was an excuse then used by the British to then declare war on China and fought a war with them again called the Second Opium War. At the conclusion of the Second Opium War, the two sides, both Britain and China, signed a Treaty of Tientsin. Go make a bullet and write down Treaty of Tientsin. So go ahead and make a bullet and write down Treaty of Tientsin. So the Treaty of Tientsin is similar in what the British wanted from the Chinese as in the First Opium War. So they wanted the ability to be able to buy more tea. They want to get more silver back from the Chinese. So both those things are in the Treaty of Tientsin. So the first thing that they got from it is they wanted to get, as I said, more places where they could buy tea at. And therefore, several more port cities were opened up to the British as well as the other foreign nations to be able to trade. Go ahead and make one and write down 10 more Chinese ports would be opened for foreign trades. 10 more Chinese ports would be open for foreign trades. Number one. So several more ports were opened up to the British so that they could trade more with the Chinese. All right, so I gave them more places where they could trade. Therefore, if there's more places for trade, there's more competition. It allows them more places where they can buy tea, but it also allows more ports to compete against each other, which would, in theory, also lower down the prices of the tea as well. So that was one of the things they got, was just more port cities being opened up. Another thing they got as well is that they originally weren't allowed to travel up the Yangtze River. Yangtze River is the big river on the south part of China. So Huanghe, big one in the north, and the Yangtze is the big one in the south part of China. So those are like the two major rivers in China. The Yangtze is the big one on the south part, and the British, as well as their foreign nations, when they won the Second Opium War, they were allowed to travel up the Yangtze River and even allowed to bring warships up the Yangtze River as well. So not just trade vessels, but also warships as well. We all talked about how they got more ports. So we already talked about how they got more ports. Another thing that ends up happening as well as that Beijing, which was the capital of China, at this time period, there weren't any permanent envoys in that city. It's not like there weren't like British envoys in China. There just wasn't any permanent envoys in Beijing. Like they weren't living in Beijing, so they didn't have like embassies basically. The Treaty of Tientsin also does allow foreign nations, Britain, France, Russia, and the United States, to have an embassy in China, basically. So they weren't allowed to be in Beijing like permanently. I mean, they could visit, an envoy and so forth, but they didn't have an embassy. So now this allows them to have embassies in China. Another thing that ends up happening, I'm getting these taels of silver. So both Britain and France are paid 2 million taels of silver, and the British merchants, are also given 2 million taels of silver. I'm not really too sure how much a tael is, so I guess I'll have to look that up. Is there a silver tael price? What do we got here? There a silver. Let's see here. Looks like that's about 4,130 RMB, but I don't know. So I guess, all right. So copy that, put you in, CNY to USD, 619 or 617.09 times 2 million. Now that was going to work now. Let's find out. There we go. All right. So that 2 million taels comes out to be $1.2 billion. Yeah. So that comes out to be $1.2 billion. So that's how much money was paid out to Britain and France individually. So Britain got $1.2 million, France got $1.2 billion, and France got $1.2 billion in silver. And then the British merchants also received $1.2 billion. All right, go ahead and make it 2. And write down British and France receive silver. And so Britain and France, and then put down the word receive silver. So that's going to be number 2. Britain and France receive silver. Yeah, which came out to be about $1.2 billion, at least converted in nowadays money. Also, another thing that ends up happening from the Treaty of Tientsin as well is that foreign missionaries, basically Christian missionaries, Catholics, Protestant missionaries, could travel into the interior parts of China and do missionary work, try to convert people to Christianity. So that was also allowed as well. They weren't originally allowed to do that either. The last couple things for a Treaty of Tientsin that it ends up doing is the Chinese were banned from referring to Westerners as Yi, which just meant barbarian. Okay. So Yi just meant barbarian. The British and French would have considered the Chinese people to be barbarians because they're lower tech than them and such. So it's kind of something that the British and French would actually consider the Chinese people to be. So they didn't like actually being called it themselves, which I know is kind of like hypocritical. But that is kind of how things kind of worked at the time period. So they didn't want anybody referring to them as barbarians, even though they pretty much saw the Chinese people as being barbarians because they didn't have as much tech as they did. But nonetheless, also the Treaty of Tientsin legalized the import of opium. We talked about before about how in the United States was not allowed to bring opium, wasn't allowed to sell opium in China. The Treaty of Tientsin gives the United States access to that sweet opium money as well. All right. Well, that's going to end this section.